Chinese machines have seized control of the lunar surface. They have been present there for several years, investigating unfamiliar areas that were formerly undiscovered, uncovering fresh findings, and crucially, they have been gathering specimens of stone and soil that have been sent back to our planet for analysis. Within those specimens, the Chinese researchers have identified something novel, something that will not merely alter our perspective on the lunar body. It might exert a substantial influence on the destiny of existence on our world. The aspect regarding the lunar orb is that the greater our knowledge grows, the more enigmatic it turns out to be. Observe, our planet is peculiar, not solely due to the inhabitants residing upon it, but because it fails to operate similarly to the remaining stony worlds in the internal solar arrangement. And our large ashen companion is primarily responsible for this anomaly. Venus represents the most comparable world to ours in the solar setup. It is almost equivalent in dimensions and mass. However, Venus lacks a satellite. Mars is likewise somewhat akin to our home. It is more compact, roughly half the extent, and Mars possesses 2 satellites, yet they are diminutive, truly tiny. Many individuals fail to recognize this, but the biggest satellite of Mars measures merely 22 kilometers in diameter, and the tiniest one is only 12 kilometers. You could accommodate both within the boundaries of Chicago City. Expanding outward to the gaseous behemoths, they feature large satellites, but they are also vastly larger celestial bodies. Jupiter exceeds Earth's mass by 318 times. Nevertheless, its satellites are essentially comparable in scale to our own. That appears odd, and it indeed is unusual. Experts continue to attempt to decipher precisely what transpires here and how our world wound up in such an atypical circumstance. This explains why we examine the lunar sphere. When the American Space Agency dispatched space travelers to traverse the lunar terrain during the 1960s and 1970s, they retrieved a substantial quantity of stone and soil. And among the initial observations by researchers was that stones on the lunar body exhibit matching traits to stones on our planet. That proved surprising. If the 2 entities had developed independently, then they would have concluded composed of distinct materials. They would resemble 2 separate bodies that encountered each other in the cosmos and commenced circling one another. We believe that is the manner most planet-satellite pairings occur. But if our world and its lunar companion are more akin to identical siblings, then they must have originated simultaneously in the identical location. But how might that occur? The dominant hypothesis that emerged after the Apollo expeditions was that our planet must have suffered a collision from a wandering world approximately the scale of Mars. This would have transpired merely a few 100 million years following the creation of the solar framework. The precise circumstances surrounding this crash have been a topic of discussion for numerous decades. But only a few years back, the hypothesis was inputted into a potent supercomputer. It executed millions of recreations until it achieved a result that duplicated all we understand concerning our world and its lunar partner. We refer to this computational depiction as the Great Splash. The power unleashed by the strike melted the 2 worlds, and the intensity of the crash ejected a large portion of our planet into the void, while the bulk of the wandering world was incorporated into our planet and descended into the center. Thus, the lunar body was somewhat like a miniature version of our world that detached and then progressed directly beside the primary planet, chilling and hardening into stony terrains. But despite all their resemblances, the lunar orb is evidently a far distinct location than our home. Presently, all that we have stated is a prominent hypothesis, but it remains merely a hypothesis. It is not confirmed, though what it does convey to us is that the more we uncover about the beginnings of the lunar body, the more we will comprehend how our own world originated. And during the last 5 years, it has been the Chinese Space Organization that has been at the forefront in lunar investigations. They have committed enormous quantities of time, effort, and funds to arrive at the exterior with mechanical explorers and pursue solutions to these enigmas. We will commence on the distant side of the lunar sphere. This constitutes a zone that the Chinese have been especially intrigued by. They were the initial country to ever access the distant side, and they have even retrieved substances that are being examined presently. They were the first nation to ever reach the far side, and they've even brought back material that is being studied today. Now, in spite of what Pink Floyd or the Transformers might have told you, this is not the dark side of the moon. It sees plenty of sun. It just never sees the Earth, or the Earth never sees it. So in theory, there should be no real difference between the near side and the far side. But that is not the case. Ironically, it's us who are looking at the dark side, because the face of the moon that we know so well is created by these low-lying areas of ancient lava. Yeah, the moon had volcanoes. We'll get to that. But on the far side, there are hardly any of those dark spots. It's mostly just light gray and dotted with hundreds of asteroid impact craters. So, we know that there is something different between the side of the moon that faces the Earth and the side that faces away. But what is it? The Change 4 mission landed on the far side in January 2019, the first spacecraft from Earth to do that, and the second Chinese mission to reach the lunar surface. Change 4 deployed a rover called U-22 that set off on a journey through the Von Karman crater. The crater has a width of 180 kilometers, which is pretty much equivalent to the length of Cuba. And this particular crater is part of the moon's South Pole Basin, which itself is a gigantic impact crater that's almost as old as the moon, dating back nearly 4 billion years and covering a diameter about 2500 km, or just slightly less wide than India. The reason that scientists on Earth are so fascinated by this impact zone is because the giant asteroid that created it would have penetrated as deep as 13 kilometers into the surface of the moon, exposing rock from deep within the lunar crust. And that is where the moon hides its most fascinating secrets. What the U-22 rover found in the base of that crater is actually believed to have come from the lunar mantle. That's the thick region of semi-solid rock that separates the outer crust from the inner core. This was the first time that rock from the mantle had been found on the moon. It was never present in any of the samples collected by Apollo astronauts. So that was just enough to pique the curiosity of scientists on Earth and leave them wanting more from the far side. Speaking of curiosity, the U-22 rover also saw something very strange on the moon in December 2021. It returned a photograph of something that appeared to be a cube-like structure in the distance. Something uniquely unnatural. Could this be the monolith that Stanley Kubrick had predicted in 2001, A Space Odyssey? No, it was just a rock. But for a couple of weeks there, they really had us going. What we saw was a trick of light and shadow combined with the fact that digital cameras have square pixels. So anything rendered at low resolution is going to look like a square until you get close enough to see its real shape. Anyway, the result here was a return to the lunar far side in 2024 with Chang'e 6. The lander touched down in the South Pole Basin just like before. Only this time, the Chinese would be collecting samples and returning them to Earth, the first ever material from the far side that had ever made its way into human hands. What Chinese scientists found was a very different kind of rock than anything that had been collected on the near side. American Apollo astronauts brought back large amounts of lunar rock and dust from the various locations where they touched down around the equator region. So, we thought that we had a pretty good idea of what the moon was made of. But turns out we were only getting half the story. Material from the far side is not only lighter in color than the near side, it also has a much different texture. The first impressions from Chinese scientists found that the dust and rock on the far side is thicker and stickier, and contained more lumps than previous moon samples. And while there is less volcanic rock on the far side, the samples of lava that the Chinese did find there have turned out to be much younger than expected. The generally accepted theory is that the far side of the moon cooled down much faster than the side that was facing the Earth, because the Earth itself was still incredibly hot and volcanically active in those early years. So what researchers expected to find on the far side would be the oldest volcanic material on the moon, and they did. One fragment of lava found by Chengxi 6 dates back 4.2 billion years, the oldest moon rock discovered so far. But they also found a lot of relatively young volcanic rocks on the far side, with an average age of 2.8 billion years. That's much younger than a lot of the samples collected by Apollo astronauts, which were typically over 3 billion years. So the picture that we're starting to reveal is a moon that was hot and molten for a much longer time than previously believed. And that actually goes against a lot of what the Big Splash theory is trying to tell us. Because if the Earth and the moon did form at the same time, and the moon is so much smaller than the Earth, then it should have cooled down and solidified much faster, especially on the far side. But it doesn't look like that's what actually happened, which brings us back to the near side. Like we said before, most of what we know comes from Apollo astronauts, but their exploration of the moon was very limited in that they could only land safely on the large flat plains at the equator region, which also tend to be the least interesting places when it comes to science and geology. Even with 3 Apollo crews having access to a car on the moon, the combined surface area explored by astronauts across all missions only covers about 25 kilometers. That's 1/5 the size of Disney World. If some alien had landed here, walked around the Magic Kingdom for a bit, and then pretended like they knew everything about the Earth, that obviously wouldn't make much sense. And this is another area where the Chinese have been making new discoveries that are quickly rewriting everything we think we know about the moon. The Chang'e 5 mission was the first sample returned from the lunar surface since the mid-1970s. And since this was an uncrewed landing, the Chinese were able to target a much more geologically interesting feature, the Runker Dome, a relatively young volcano in the northwest region of the near side. Volcanoes on the moon work a little differently from what you've probably seen on Earth. They don't violently explode up into a sky and leave behind steep, jagged mountains. Instead, a lunar volcano is formed over a thin spot on the surface where lava has been able to escape and slowly leak out over millions of years, creating this extremely wide and flat dome shape. What Chang'e 5 managed to find in the area around the Runker Dome was the youngest rock sample ever returned at around 2 billion years old, which again is helping scientists to understand that the moon has not been a cold, dead rock for anywhere near as long as previously believed. China is also helping to redefine what the moon is made out of. One of the first major discoveries from the Chang'e sample was a new mineral that was never seen before on the Earth or the moon. They named it changesite, and it's not the type of gray rock that you'd expect to find up there. It's a crystal, transparent, and colorless. The only piece of changesite that we have is smaller than the width of a human hair, but it's enough to tell us something very important about this new mineral.